Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video looking at gender roles and relationships, focusing on power relationships. Sociologists look at the power relationships between males and females in the family, but what do they mean by power relationships? Well, power relationships refer to how power is distributed in the family and how equal relationships are within that family. There are two areas to examine in this respect: the distribution of power between males and females in decision making, which we'll look at in a separate video. A second aspect of power relationships is the control one person looks to exert over the other, what we commonly would refer to as domestic violence, and that's what we're going to discuss in this video. There are other power relationships in the family, namely between parents and their children, and we will look at some of those in our series on childhood. Domestic violence can take several different forms, but there is a common thread of one person looking to exert control over the other. It's just the means that they use to achieve this that differ. Often in cases of domestic violence, more than one of the following forms are present. Firstly, sexual violence. Forcing a partner to commit sexual acts without their explicit consent is a form of domestic violence. Secondly, there is physical violence. Using force to control the behaviour of a partner is the most obvious form of domestic violence, and is what people usually believe domestic violence to be. However, there are more subtle and equally devastating forms of domestic violence, such as psychological violence, using psychological methods to make a partner doubt themselves and have low self-esteem, or using emotional blackmail to control a partner's actions. There is also financial violence, controlling a person's access to resources until they comply with the wishes of a partner. Domestic violence figures are notoriously difficult to measure, seen as being part of the dark figure of crime, as many people do not report domestic violence for fear of retribution. However, in the year ending March 2019, an estimated 2.4 million adults aged 16 to 74 experienced domestic abuse. Surprisingly, the evidence collected by the Crime Survey of England and Wales reported that almost a third of those who fell victim to domestic abuse were male. Although we have to remember that these figures are estimates, and that people may experience far more domestic abuse than they are willing to report. So why does domestic violence occur? According to War Club, domestic violence is widespread in society, and there is no such thing as a typical offender. While psychologists might look to certain traits a person displays, sociologists instead focused on the increased strain in everyday lives that leads to frustration and increased hostility towards a partner. This can continue for many years, particularly with psychological violence, where coercive partners can control the thoughts, identity and actions of an individual without them realising that they are subject to abuse, and without any sanction of their behaviours. One of the groundbreaking pieces of research into domestic violence was released by Dobash and Dobash in the late 1970s and revisited 21 years later. They suggested that males look to assert their patriarchal control over women's behaviours, what they wear, who they speak to, how they spend their money, and through physical force, financial control, or through psychological means. Dobash and Dobash studied the victims of domestic violence and found that conflicting opinions between partners over the woman's behaviour often preceded some form of domestic abuse. Women were seen as not living up to their partner's expectations of their behaviour, according to many cases that Dobash and Dobash studied. Simply put, they did not do what men wanted them to, and so males exerted control. Psychological explanations of domestic violence are sometimes covered by sociologists, with Gilligan asserting that domestic violence is often brought about by feelings of inadequacy to conform to social roles. For males, this is the role of the provider, and as women have become increasingly financially independent of males, this has led to them taking back control over finances, so men revert to other forms of control. Other psychological approaches, such as that by Gilchrist et al., suggest that the personality traits of offenders are more likely to impact on their willingness to control their partners through some form of violence against them. Feminists suggest that the explanation for domestic violence by males against females is the most basic form of patriarchal control. They suggest that males need to exert power over women that challenge males' expectations of them, and males will use whatever means are at their disposal to re-establish their power over women. Marxist feminists would suggest that the nature of the family has the potential to accelerate this, with women expected to absorb the frustrations and alienation of workers in the home. Women being seen as the slaves of wage slaves gives males somebody to control to alleviate the frustrations of being exploited through capitalism. When this control is challenged, males are likely to react in other ways to reassert their dominance in the home. However, this doesn't explain why there has been an increase in the number of males suffering from domestic violence. How have governments looked to tackle the issue of domestic violence? Well, governments over time have looked to tackle domestic violence through the application of different social policies to tackle domestic abuse. In 1991, the removal of the marital rape exclusion clause meant that males could now be prosecuted for having non-consensual sex with their partners. It had previously been assumed that once a woman had consented to marriage, that she was giving her consent to her husband for all sexual activities. Another policy that allowed women to escape unhappy marriages was the Divorce Reform Act in 1969, which made divorce easier, while a provision of lone parent and child benefits provided some financial stability for women leaving their partners. Offences that targeted former partners, including legislation against stalking in 2008, and prior to the general election, the Domestic Abuse Bill, which was due to be passed, although this was delayed by the prorogation of Parliament by the Conservative Party. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on gender roles and relationships, focusing on power relationships. Thanks for watching.